A chestnut Mustang was agonizing, trapped on the tracks as the train approached. Eduardo sped up his Mercedes to drive past. Animal problems didn't pay his bills. But when he saw the white, star-shaped mark on the horse's forehead, he slammed on the brakes. That mark was impossible to ignore. What happened next, no one expected. Before we begin this story of redemption and second chances, tell me where you're watching from and hit like if you believe. We sometimes need to be saved to learn how to save. Ready? Let's go. Eduardo Marino adjusted the knot of his $2,000 Italian tie and watched the frantic construction from his office window. Another railway line being born, more money coming in. At 58, he owned the largest private railway empire in the country. Built brick by brick on land he bought for next to nothing from desperate families. That morning, he had signed the eviction order for another 12 families. When his assistant mentioned that one of the owners was a widow with 3 young children, Eduardo didn't even look up from his papers. She should have thought of that before she couldn't make her payments, he muttered, stamping the document indifferently. Sentiments were a luxury men like him couldn't afford. Compassion didn't pay bills. Tears didn't build empires. He had learned that the hard way 15 years ago, when letting his heart speak cost him everything he loved most. Since then, he lived alone in his penthouse, surrounded by glass and steel, just as he liked it, cold, impenetrable, safe. The phone rang. It was the engineer in charge of the new line, cutting through Dry Creek Valley inland. Mr. Eduardo, we need your approval to speed up construction. The residents of the area are... Eduardo cut him off before he could finish. Local problems weren't his responsibility. 2 hours later, he was driving his black Mercedes along the dirt roads towards the construction site. He hated leaving the city, but some international investors demanded his personal presence to release more funds. Money spoke louder than convenience. The road wound between hills covered in dry grass when Eduardo saw something that made him brake sharply. On the newly laid tracks, a chestnut horse struggled desperately against something that held its hind leg between the wooden ties. The animal whinnied loudly, its eyes wide with terror, foam flecking its mouth. Eduardo checked his Rolex. He had a meeting in 40 minutes. He grabbed his cell phone to call someone to handle it, but there was no signal. He huffed, annoyed. It wasn't his problem. Animals got into trouble all the time, law of nature. He was about to accelerate when the horse turned its head towards him. A perfect white star-shaped mark adorned its forehead, contrasting with its dark chestnut coat. Eduardo felt something strange stir in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. In the distance, the low rumble of a locomotive echoed through the hills, the 3:15 freight train, punctual as always. Eduardo knew that schedule by heart. He had personally planned the entire logistics of that line. The horse whinnied again, more desperately now. Its muscles trembled with exhaustion and fear. Clearly wild, it had never felt human touch, and now it faced an imminent death trapped in the iron and wood snare. Eduardo looked at his $3,000 suit, his genuine Italian leather shoes. He looked at the horse, at the tracks. He heard the train approaching. "Damn it," he grumbled, getting out of the car. It wasn't out of compassion. It was simply market value. A horse like that was worth at least $15,000. It made financial sense, at least that's what he kept telling himself as he ran towards the tracks, loosening his tie along the way. Eduardo knelt beside the animal, ignoring the mud staining his suit. The horse thrashed violently at his presence, nearly kicking him in the head. It had clearly been born and raised in freedom. Every movement screamed wildness and independence. "Easy, easy," he murmured, more to himself than the animal. The hind leg was caught between 2 ties. It had probably tried to cross the tracks and slipped. The sound of the train was closer now, accompanied by the growing vibration in the rails. Eduardo tried to move the ties with his hands, but they were fixed with industrial bolts. He ran back to the car, grabbed the spare tire wrench and hurried back. His hands trembled, not from fear, he told himself, But from irritation at wasting time on this, the horse watched him with intelligent, wary eyes. It was about 8 years old, Eduardo calculated, strong and well-built. The star mark on its forehead seemed to gleam under the afternoon sun, hypnotic in its perfection. Something about that mark bothered him deeply, like a song he couldn't get out of his head. He worked frantically with the wrench, loosening bolt after bolt. Sweat streamed down his face, staining his Italian shirt. The train was less than a mile away now. He could see black smoke rising on the horizon. "Come on, damn it, come on!" He finally managed to loosen the tie enough to free the animal's leg. The horse staggered to its feet, but didn't run. It stood there, watching Eduardo with unnerving intensity. The sound of the train was deafening now. Eduardo stood up to run, but tripped over his own feet, exhausted from the effort. He fell face first onto the tracks, his head spinning. He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't respond. The last coherent thought he had was about how ironic it was, the man who built train tracks dying, crushed by one. When he woke up, he was lying on the grass beside the railway line. His head throbbed, his mouth as dry as cotton, his suit was dirty and torn, his shoes lost somewhere. Slowly, the memories returned, the horse, the tracks, the train. He sat up abruptly and looked around. The train had already passed, leaving only the distant echo of its whistle. But the horse was there, grazing calmly a few yards away, as if nothing had happened. Eduardo touched his head, feeling a painful lump. How on earth had he gotten off the tracks? He couldn't remember anything beyond the fall. Then he noticed something strange. His blazer was torn at the shoulder, as if something had pulled him hard. He looked again at the horse. The animal raised its head and met his gaze directly, chewing slowly. For an absurd moment, Eduardo had the impression of gratitude in its eyes. "Impossible," he muttered, staggering to his feet. Wild animals didn't save humans. It was against all survival instincts. But as he walked back to the car, one question hammered in his mind. How exactly had he gotten off those tracks, and why hadn't the horse run away? Eduardo arrived home 3 hours late. Ignoring the furious calls from investors, he took a long, hot shower, but couldn't stop thinking about the horse, that star mark, that look that seemed to recognize him. The next morning, he cancelled all meetings and returned to Dry Creek Valley. He found the horse grazing near the tracks, as if waiting for his return. This time, he had brought carrots and apples, not out of sentimentality, but because well-fed animals were worth more in the market. "You're not going to give me trouble today, are you?" he grumbled, keeping a safe distance. The horse raised its head, watching him with that same unnerving intensity from the day before. Eduardo noticed an old wooden fence a few hundred yards away, half destroyed by time. He approached to inspect it and found a metal sign corroded by the years: Dry Creek Ranch, Mourinho family, 1987. His blood ran cold. Mourinho, his surname. But it was impossible. He had never owned land there. He ran back to the car and grabbed his tablet, frantically searching the property records for the area. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. That land had belonged to Joaquim Mourinho until 2010, his father. Eduardo leaned against the car, his legs weak. Joaquim Mourinho, who had died 15 years ago in a car accident while returning from one of his desperate attempts at reconciliation with his only son. Eduardo had refused to see him that last time, too busy with a business merger that seemed more important than forgiving a man who just wanted his son's love back. With trembling hands, he called the local county clerk. The employee confirmed. Joaquim had acquired that land in 1985, 2 years after Eduardo cut ties with him. He had kept the ranch until his death, raising wild horses that he protected from poaching. "Mr. Joaquim used to come here every week," the woman said. "He fed the mustangs that lived free on the property. He said one day his son would return and want to see them. He kept the deed in Eduardo's name until the end. Eduardo hung up the phone, his hands shaking. He walked to the dilapidated fence, searching for more traces of the past. He found, half buried in the dirt, a small metal safe. Inside, a yellowed letter and a faded photograph. The photo showed Joaquim smiling next to a chestnut mare with a white star-shaped mark on her forehead, exactly like the horse he had found on the tracks. In the letter, his father's shaky handwriting. "Eduardo, I know you hate me for what happened to your mother, but I never stopped believing that one day you would understand that love sometimes manifests in ways we can't see at the time. The horses here are descendants of Estrella, the mare your mother loved. As long as they are free, a part of her will live on too. I always wait for you. Dad." The letter was dated a week before the accident. Eduardo looked at the horse grazing peacefully. A descendant of Estrella, the animal his mother had loved before she died of cancer when he was only 20 years old. The mare his father had sold to pay for her treatment, causing the rift that destroyed their family forever. Tears he had suppressed for decades finally rolled down his face. Eduardo spent the following days obsessively researching his father. He discovered that Joaquim had bought 15 wild horses over the years, all descendants of Estrella, and kept them free on the dry Creek Valley lands. He had created a small, informal sanctuary, feeding them and protecting them from hunters. In the local veterinary records, he found detailed notes about each animal. The horse he had saved was named Tempestad in the papers, son of Estrella Segundo, grandson of the original mare. He was 8 years old and had never been domesticated, just as his father had planned. The most painful discovery came from a recorded interview Joaquim had given to the local newspaper 3 years before his death. "My son thinks I sold Estrella for money," the recorded voice said. "But I knew that if she stayed with us, Eduardo would never forgive me for not selling everything to save his mother. Sometimes love requires us to do the thing that hurts the most, to spare those we love from even greater pain." Eduardo had to stop the recording, tears blurring his vision. That night, his phone rang insistently. It was Rodrigo, his majority partner. "Eduardo, where the hell are you? The Japanese canceled the meeting. They said you're unreliable. I'm handling family matters." "What family matters? You don't have a family." The crudeness of the words hit Eduardo like a slap. "Listen, we have the China deal to sign tomorrow, $50 million. If you don't show up, I'll sign it alone and remove you from the partnership." Eduardo looked out the window of the cheap hotel where he was staying. He could see the distant lights marking where Tempestad was likely sleeping, free under the stars as his father had dreamed. "Sign it yourself, Rodrigo. I'm out." "Have you lost your mind over what, a stray horse?" Eduardo hung up the phone and turned it off completely. The next morning, the local veterinarian came to examine Tempestad. "He has an infection in his hoof where it was trapped," Dr. Santos explained. "He needs daily treatment for at least 2 weeks. If not treated, he could develop sepsis." Eduardo didn't hesitate. He rented a small house in town and arranged full treatment for the animal. When Rodrigo called from the airport, yelling about how the Chinese had withdrawn their offer due to disrespect, Eduardo just listened in silence. "You lost 50 million, Eduardo. 50 million. "I lost much more than that 15 years ago," he replied calmly, "and it took me all this time to understand." In the following days, he sold his company shares for 1/3 of their actual value. The financial newspapers speculated about stress, depression, a midlife crisis. Eduardo gave no interviews. Instead, he spent his mornings watching Tempestad recover. The horse had begun to accept his presence, though it maintained its wild distance. When Eduardo approached with medication, Tempestad tensed, but didn't flee. It was a start. For the first time in decades, Eduardo slept soundly. without the nightmares about the last conversation he never had with his father. 6 months later, Eduardo had sold his penthouse and most of his assets. He bought back the Dry Creek Valley lands from the real estate speculators who had acquired them after his father's death, paying 3 times the market value. He didn't care about the price. Some things had no monetary value. He rebuilt the fence, not to trap the horses, but to protect them from hunters. Tempestade now approached when he saw him arrive, though its wild nature remained intact. Eduardo had learned to respect it. The first person he sought out was Maria Santos, the widow he had evicted 2 years prior. He found her living in a shack on the outskirts with her 3 children. When he knocked on the door, she recognized him immediately, and her face closed off. "What do you want here?" Eduardo extended an envelope. "The deed to the house you lost. It's in your name again, no conditions." Maria opened the envelope with trembling hands. "Why?" "Because I owed it to you, and to myself." She didn't thank him, she didn't smile, but her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Eduardo didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted to do what was right. The second person was harder to find. John Pereira, the employee he had fired over the phone at Christmas, had moved to another state. Eduardo drove 800 kilometers to find him working as a night security guard at a warehouse. "I came to apologize," Eduardo said when John recognized him. 15 years late, John replied, bitter. "I know, and I came to offer your old position back with all your lost salary updated plus profit sharing." John studied his face. "What happened to you?" Eduardo looked at his own hands, calloused now from caring for the horses. "I discovered the man my father wanted me to be was still alive somewhere. He just needed to be dug up." Not everyone forgave him. Robert Silva, whose farm he had taken to build a railway line, simply slammed the door in his face. Eduardo didn't insist. He understood that there were wounds time didn't heal, and regrets that came too late. But he kept trying. To every person he had harmed, to every injustice he could rectify. He used the money he had left for this, sleeping in a simple house he had built on his father's land, close to the horses. Tempestade now came when Eduardo called him, though he never allowed himself to be ridden or tethered. It was exactly as it should be, free but trusting. Eduardo had learned that loving wasn't possessing. One night, sitting on the porch watching the horse graze under the full moon, Eduardo picked up a sheet of paper and wrote, "Dad, I know I can't undo what I did. I can't go back and be the son you deserved, be present when you needed me, or say the words you wanted to hear. But I can take care of what you loved. I can try to be the man you believed I could become. Tempestade is free, as you wanted, and I finally understand." He folded the letter and buried it next to the old fence where he had found his father's words. It was the closest he would get to forgiveness. 2 years passed. Eduardo was now 60, his hair completely gray, his hands permanently dirt-stained. Tempestade, at 10 years old, showed the first signs of maturity, slower movements, an air of wisdom in his dark eyes. The Joaquim Marinho Sanctuary now housed 23 wild horses, all descendants of Estrella. Eduardo had hired 2 local veterinarians and created a protection program that served as a model for other regions. The money came from donations and his own early retirement. He had saved just enough to live modestly. One afternoon, while checking the north fence, Eduardo heard the familiar sound of an expensive car driving up the dirt road. A black Audi stopped near the gate, and a man in a suit, clearly annoyed, stepped out. "Are you Eduardo Marinho?" the man asked. "I'm Marcelo Ferreira from Ferreira Construction. We have a proposal for your land." Eduardo continued hammering the wire. "It's not for sale." 40 million, Marcelo said, as if that settled it. "That's 3 times the market value." Eduardo stopped hammering and looked at him. He recognized himself from 2 years ago in that man, the arrogance, the certainty that everything had a price, the barely disguised contempt for those who lived more simply. My answer is no. Listen here, you. Marcelo stopped himself when Tempestade approached the fence, watching the stranger with suspicion. Look, I know types like you get attached to these rural traditions. But think rationally. 40 million. You can buy any other land. This isn't just any other land, Eduardo said calmly. This holds the memory of people I loved. Marcelo scoffed. Sentimentalism doesn't pay bills. Eduardo smiled sadly. I used to say the same thing. When Marcelo left, furious at the refusal, Eduardo sat on the fence next to Tempestade. The horse allowed him to touch its neck, an intimacy they had developed gradually based on mutual respect. Do you know what I've learned? Eduardo said to the horse. That life isn't about accumulating. It's about preserving what truly matters. That night, Eduardo found among his father's papers a diary he hadn't read before. The last entry, written a week before the accident, said, Eduardo turned 43 today. He didn't call me as usual, but I bought a gift anyway. I expanded the horse's territory by another 50 acres. One day, when he's my age, perhaps he'll understand that some gifts are given not to be opened, but to be preserved. That some things only make sense when time teaches us to see beyond ourselves. Eduardo closed the diary, finally understanding. His father hadn't bought that land as an investment. He had bought it as a message, a love letter written in acres and fences, in free horses and open sky. A message that said, when you tire of chasing the wind, you'll have a home waiting. Eduardo looked at Tempestade, now lying near the porch. For 15 years, he had been running. Now, finally, he was home. On the 15th anniversary of his father's death, Eduardo organized a small ceremony at the ranch. A few people came: Maria Santos with her now teenage children, Dr. Santos the veterinarian, John Pereira, who had accepted a position as the sanctuary's administrator. Eduardo didn't give speeches. He simply opened the gates and let the visitors observe the horses in freedom. Tempestade, now 12 years old, and clearly the patriarch of the herd, grazed serenely near the group of children watching him in fascination. Is he tame? Asked Maria's youngest daughter. He's neither tame nor wild, Eduardo replied. He is free, and he chooses to trust. After everyone had left, Eduardo walked to the makeshift grave he had made for his father, a simple stone with his name and dates. Surrounded by wildflowers, Tempestade followed him, as he often did in the most important moments. Dad, Eduardo said softly, it took me 15 years, but I finally understood your letter. You weren't waiting for me here. You were preparing me to find myself. The wind rustled the trees around them, carrying the distant sound of the other horses. Eduardo remembered a conversation he had with his mother when he was only 10 years old, weeks before she fell ill. What happens when we die, Mom? We live on in the things we love and leave in the world, she had replied. In the horses we protect, in the people we help, in the love we spread. Eduardo looked at Tempestade, who now had a few grey hairs in his mane. In terms of lifespan for a wild horse, both were approaching autumn, but there was no fear in this awareness, only gratitude. His phone vibrated. It was a message from a journalist wanting to do a story about the millionaire who abandoned everything for horses. Eduardo deleted the message without replying. His story wasn't about abandonment. It was about finding what truly mattered. That night, Eduardo wrote in his own journal, a habit he had acquired in recent years. Today, I turned 60. Tempestade turned 12. In the wild, he might have 3 or 4 more years ahead. I, with luck, 15 or 20. But for the first time in decades, I don't fear the end. I know that when my time comes, I won't die as I lived for 45 years, alone and empty. I will die knowing I honored the memory of those who loved me, that I protected what my father built, that I transformed money into something that will last longer than a bank account. The horses will continue to be free. The children of the region will continue to come meet them. And perhaps somewhere my parents are proud of the man I finally learned to be. Eduardo closed the journal and went out to the porch. Tempestade was lying near the house, something he had started doing after they developed their silent friendship. The horse raised its head when he saw him, whinnying softly. "Thank you, old friend," Eduardo whispered, "for saving me that day, and for teaching me that sometimes we need to lose almost everything to discover what is truly worth saving." Under the stars of Dry Creek Valley, man and horse shared the silence of mutual understanding, guarding together the memory of those they had loved. This story is about regret and second chances, about the words we didn't say, the calls we didn't make, the people we left behind while chasing things that ultimately don't matter. If you have someone you love but are distant from due to pride, hurt, or being too busy, don't wait for an accident on the tracks to learn what truly matters. Call, write, show up, because unlike Eduardo, you still have time, and perhaps the person on the other side is also waiting for a second chance. If this story reminded you of someone special, or if you believe it's never too late to start over, please share. We never know who needs to hear this today. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.